You are listening to the Enormocast.
Recently, I was sitting there doing nothing when it hit me. Climbing wasn't feeling the way it used to. The sends and the best day evers just weren't quite as sparkly. The click of the quick draw wasn't quite shining the jewels the way it used to. That's when I asked Sportiva about running. And Sportiva said, "Yeah, it's all right. J-Star swears by it, you know, and he climbs 515. And I said, you're still not quite selling it. And they said, "Quit being a wuss and try the Prodigio." And I said, "No thanks, I had a big breakfast." And they said, "No, dumbass, Prodigio is our line of next-gen mountain running shoes." And I said, "Okay, fine, it can't hurt." But I was wrong. Running does hurt a little bit, but it also complements the climbing life just right. Easy to do right out of the van, expands that aerobic capacity for long approaches and big routes, and the endorphins are top-notch. Turns out that Sportiva's Prodigio line of mountain runners is perfect for my climbing gnarled feet. Cushy, light, airy, and fleet. So, if you need something to remind you why climbing is so great, you too should ask Sportiva about running in the Prodigio line. The Prodigio Pro, the Max, or the Original. Don't just do it for your health and well-being, do it for J-Star and those sweet, sweet endorphins.
There was once a time, eons ago, when a person bought a product once and used it for the rest of their lives. In fact, once they died, in accordance with local rites, their entrails and organs were removed, stored, and they were wrapped and entombed under 6 million tons of cut limestone with those indestructible possessions so they could be useful in the afterlife. Well, the folks at Yeti want you to think of their products the same way. You know, minus the pulling the organs through your nasal cavity and the death and all that. We live in a time with too much cheap throwaway crap, pardon my French, and stuff like the Yeti Tundra Cooler, the Yonder water bottle, and Yeti's plethora of stainless drinkware is built to combat that deplorable trend. Yeti products don't just last. By Horus, they work. In fact, if I wake up on the dark side of the sticks without my 26-ounce stainless steel Rambler hot cold water bottle with the leak-proof chug cap, old Osiris is going to hear about it. So do yourself and your future ghost a favor and check out all Yeti's bomber products at Yeti.com or your local outdoor goods retailer. Because just in case you end up down under, you're going to want a cold drink in hell.
Listen, where are you playing in town? You playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
a
big
house. We
place
sold
that
it
side
out.
of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold
What's
it
that,
out.
20,000
seats.
You really should.
The hell are you doing? I couldn't sleep. I'm checking the ropes. There was a frayed end on your rope, and I'm cutting it out.
Bad weather. Now or later, anytime. Good time.
Today's show is brought to you by La Sportiva
Arc'teryx Equipment.
and with support from Maxim Ropes. Maxim has been keeping the Enormocast off the deck since 2012.
And now, we can also thank the chill folks at Yeti. And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is September 30th, 2025, about 10:30 a.m. here in Colorado. And this is episode 313. I don't know why I'm stuck on 200. I've done that a few times this year. Said 200 and then left it in the episode. It's 313 of the Enormocast. A conversation with two gentlemen, Dave Groth and Leo Hermacinski. And now this interview idea started out with just an interview with Dave Groth. I met Dave at the Winona Ice Fest last winter, and he is a legendary Devil's Lake climber, deep member of the infamous DLFA, which we talk about finally in this episode. Get to the bottom of what that was, maybe is. Dave is one of the most prolific and influential climbers that probably most of you have never heard of. Now, I know some upper Midwesterners just slam their fist on the table. How dare you, sir? But it turns out I think the rest of the country doesn't know a lot about the history of the climbing that goes on there in central and eastern Wisconsin. Sorry, folks, but that's what I'm here for, is to make up for that lack of knowledge. However, when it came time to do the podcast, Dave happened to be here in the Roaring Fork Valley, where I live, visiting his longtime friend and climbing partner, Leo Hermacinski. And while Leo does not have the legend status of Mr. Groth, he was there too, with Dave, traveling the world and watching, supporting, even belaying Dave on some of the cutting edge ascents that he did. So I thought it would be a fun way to add a little perspective to the interview. And it turned out my instincts were correct. So I want to thank Leo for pinch hitting, coming in at the last minute to help make the perspective on this podcast that much deeper. So I love delving into deep climbing history on the Enormocast. It's part of the reason I started it. It's funny because the truth is that these historical ones with less well-known people don't hit the way, me finding the latest, greatest, most popular climber and having them on my podcast. That helps my numbers. If I could have Honnold on every episode, well, that would certainly jump the numbers up a little bit. That was the genius of Fitz Gahal up there at the Climbing Gold podcast. How can I have Honnold on every episode? Well, let's have him host. Touché, duct tape, then beer. But guess what? I don't care. I'm going to keep doing these types of podcasts. I think the last one that was really in this vein was Jim Erickson last December. And that's a little bit of a partner interview to this one, because Jim cut his teeth at Devil's Lake, which is where Dave made a name for himself as well. So what do we have here? A deep history of Devil's Lake free climbing, a glimpse at what it was like to be a dirtbag climber in the 80s, traveling the world, a profile of two guys, Leo and Dave, who both just love climbing for the sake of it. There was no path to riches and fame for either one of these guys when they were climbing, and it didn't matter to them. Truly, they did it for the love of the game. And the game in Devil's Lake, Wisconsin in the late 70s and 80s was hardcore. A very hardcore game for a lot of these climbers. And one little mention, even though it's way out in the distance, since I have a captive audience here of some upper Midwesterners, I will be at both the Winona Ice Fest and the Michigan Ice Fest again this year. We don't need to talk about dates or anything like that. You can Google it. I'll be there, duties to be determined. And maybe, just maybe, in 2026, I'll beat this year's ice climbing pitch count of about 12. I think I did about 12 top ropes this year on ice, although the year's not over. Anyway, going for 13 next year. All right, let's get to it. A conversation with Dave Groth and Leo Hermacinski.
First came the Archaeopteryx, a compact feathered dinosaur who dared to fly, maybe. But at the very least, they dared to be different with their cute little feathers out there strutting around like primal chickens. Tip of the hat to those mighty but mini mavericks. Then, some 150 million years later, one of them half-pint bosses was dug up, and its rebel attitude inspired the founding of Arc'teryx Equipment. These days, Arc'teryx is known for its own forward-thinking design instincts in apparel. But did you know that it all started with climbing harnesses? That's right. In 1989, the sport was a-changin', and clunky, uncomfortable harnesses were not going to fly. 36 years later, Arc'teryx has refined their harness offerings to just two flawless designs, the Skaha and the AR395, which is a mouthful. Personally, I'd named it the Bugaboo, but I'm not in charge, am I? The Skaha excels in sport and short climbing, and the AR are all-round, boasts blazonry for big routes and alpine. Both these sleek saddles come from the vapor harness lineage we all remember, where lightweight breathability does not compromise comfort and function. So check out them harnesses hiding amongst all that amazing apparel at Arc'teryx.com or your local shop. And fly off them routes with the same confidence that our little feathered dino friend took to the sky so long ago.
So you guys found Arapiles like in the mid-'80s.
Yeah, for us it was on sort of the tick list of world places where rock climbing was, taken off. Australian rock climbing.
Yeah, because Gulick had just done Punks in the Gym, right? And then that was in all the magazines. And I was finishing my thesis in London. I saw in Mountain Magazine an announcement that they were having a World Rock Climbing Festival or something like that at Arapiles. I was like, cool, I'm going. So I went down to a travel agent, I got a ticket and just showed up there. And everybody was down there. It was really exciting, like all the leading lights. Kurt Albert and Kurt Smith was there, and just all the people you'd read about in the magazines, all doing these super hard routes. And the climbing was outstanding.
So for us, we knew it was quartzite, like Devil's Lake and sandstone. So, it was kind of familiar to us. And, guys would talk about, you can put like a number 4 RP in and run it out 20 feet off the RP. And like that was attractive to us because that was home for us. So a lot of guys would go down there and get a little blown out by the quartzite. But, if you've climbed at Devil's Lake, you know what that's like. I mean, it's just a very precise style. Arapiles is a little different because some of the stuff's rounded. And then at the top of that rounded hole, there's a little in-cut edge, But it was cool. I would say that was my first experience with doing an entire route that wasn't a Yosemite slab, that was bolts.
It was the beginnings of sport climbing.
Yeah, that's what we recognized it. There was a little happening at Smith. Like Alan Watts was up there, had 12 routes, and, Skinner was pushing it a little bit in some places. But in the States, it was just kind of starting, and we went down there, and they had, a fair amount of what I would call sport routes.
And I can't remember, had you been to Smith before we went to Raps?
That's a question.
You don't remember either?
Yeah, I don't remember. I might have. No, it was after.
Okay.
It was a different trip.
Yeah, because that was the first time I'd ever seen just bolted routes, like you say.
Yeah, it was the following year. I went to Smith with Jose Perea, and we went up there and we climbed like 14 days straight, and then came back to the valley. It was cool. It was a different time. It was like, but we came. When we saw that, and we're like, we saw that as, hey, this is the way this thing's going to go. And then we had a little window into the bolt wars in the valley, right in the middle of that thing, and knew some of the guys on both sides of the argument. And I just kind of, at one point in time, you're like, man, you got to stand on one side of the fence or the other. And to us, it just looked like the way, the trip to Australia, to me, cemented that the sport climbing was the way that thing was going to go. Because it just gave you lines that you weren't going to do without.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was pretty clear.
Yeah, no protection.
Yeah, but it's really interesting to listen to you guys because obviously we're here to talk a lot about Devil's Lake. The ethic there is pretty strictly no bolting. Explain just kind of like you had this ethic that you grew up with bolt climbing or however you want to talk about your cutting your teeth in Devil's Lake, but you were right away to embrace this this looks like the future.
Before I ever did a sport route, I had learned traditional climbing. It was the way everything was done. In Devil's Lake, you top roped a lot, which was helpful to accelerate you as a climber. Because in a lot of places like the valley, it was very hierarchical. Everything was ground up. So you're literally, if you're a 512 climber, you become a 512 climber on lead in a place like that. Or you boulder. You boulder till you get good enough to boulder, till you can figure out that stuff on lead. And that just wasn't an option at Devil's Lake. So people embraced the bouldering. So the ethic was a little different, which is, I think, part of the story of that place, why it kicked out so many good climbers, was the way you needed to climb. So it was like you'd go out there on a day and essentially you're top rope bouldering. So right out of the box, you'd hit all the 510s and, you climb all the easy routes, and pretty soon you're into these 511s and these 12s that are essentially, boulder problems. So you got good fast, as opposed to a guy in the valley who you couldn't just run out and just start hangdogging your way up something. That just wasn't an acceptable way. So I think that style, and it's true like in England, the style makes you a little better climber.
Why didn't Devil's Lake embrace bolting when the rest of the world did it? Is because top roping was an accepted way of establishing a first descent, which really surprised me because in the UK, there's no people. Of course, people top rope things, but you weren't getting your route in the guide and your name in there until it was lead ground up. And even hang dogging. Oh my God, that was just like a sin against humanity. If you were doing that, of course, history shows that they embraced that and people got really good, and then they started bolting. Depending on the rock, right? The limestone was bolted, the grit's still really pure. But in Devil's Lake, I get there and like many of the hardest climbs that were in the existing guidebook had not been led at the time. That's probably the case. Like Cheap Thrills, that hadn't been led yet. When I arrived there was the infamous DLFA. They were the better climbers, and those were the guys that were really starting to push it. And Dave included there, doing these really heady, dangerous leads. And the Arapiles discussion when we say the RP is kind of interesting because that brings it full circle, because the RPs were one of the pieces of gear technology that opened up a lot of these pretty sketchy leads at the lake to turn it from a top rope to a lead. And still not a whole lot of people have led these routes to this day. It takes a really talented climber with a really, really steady head.
Right, which is like if you were climbing in England, that was long time the tradition there, at least on the gritstone.
Exactly.
And so, but your history, Leo, is that you were from Wisconsin.
Chicago area.
Sorry, you were from the Chicago area. That's right. You told me that.
Yeah.
So you were from the Chicago area, but learned to climb in England, and then came back and was like, all right, I'm a climber. Where can I climb? And
yeah, it's funny. So, I'd been in England.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. No, I'd been in England, high school and college, and I wanted to stay there. I had a job offer, but Mrs. Thatcher didn't want any Americans getting work visas there. So I came back and went down to one of the few stores in Chicago that sold climbing gear, Erewhon. And they had a notice board, and I did what you do as a new climber. I said, hey, new in town, looking to climb 5'9", 5'10", put my phone number down, didn't get a single call from anybody. And like years later, people would say, oh yeah, I saw that notice. That was you. I was like, well, why didn't you call? And it's not something people did. And then people would either have their partners or coming out of Chicago Mountaineering Club was a big part of the climbing scene at the lake. They had written the last several guidebooks and the current guidebook at the time. And I think it was the third weekend of every month, a non-member could show up and they'd take you out climbing. And so, I started climbing with these guys.
I mean, the 5'10" probably scared everybody away too.
Maybe at the time, and I might have been exaggerating.
Oh, right.
As to my ability. But yeah, and it's like anywhere else. You kind of find your people. And when I was in England, and any sport I've personally have been involved in, I've always liked going out with people who are better than me, whether it's cycling, skiing, whatever it is, because it's more fun and they drag you along and they push you. And I, frankly wasn't finding that with a lot of the CMC guys. Great people, really enthusiastic climbers. But then I started running into guys like Dave here and some of the people we'll probably talk about. And as well as being really good climbers and also really accepting of someone who just shows up and, wants to climb as hard as they can. They were just real cast of characters and just great fun to hang out with.
Do you remember that?
Oh yeah,
that scene, Leo showing up or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're around a bunch of, Chicago. Some people from Chicago, people from Madison. I grew up in eastern Wisconsin. When I was a kid, if I would have known there was climbing at Devil's Lake, I would have went there. I didn't start to climb there till I was about 20, and finally one of my friend's dad learned to climb at the Hoofers, and he said, why don't you guys go to Devil's Lake and learn to climb? And I was like, and the minute we showed up there, I was going, hit the ground running. But I remember meeting you, and one of my first longtime partners just lives out here. Do you know Ken Sauls?
Yeah, I do know Ken.
Yeah, Ken. So me and him climbed a lot. We climbed a couple walls together, climbed a bunch of alpine climbs together. And then what happened was guys would either be there in college or they headed west or something, and he moved out this way. And so, you had to, every couple of years you'd mix it up, get new partners. But
you stayed in the Midwest. You probably had the longest tenure of any of those guys I knew from mid-'80s.
For me, it was what I did for money, my trade. And I always looked at sort of more like the Leighton Core model, where the guy was a bricklayer, and then I made a bunch of money at my trade. I'd get some money, I'd work for 6-8 months and then I'd hit the road. And I did that pretty much through my whole 20s, like probably 8-10 years where, I worked maybe 8 months at the most, but sometimes 4 months. And then usually when I was on the road, I'm in the Valley, I'm in Europe, I'm in Australia. That's one of the things in the Midwest as you travel. I mean, there's a little bit of an upside, and I always had money because I made good money. Like in the 80s, I think I was making $25 an hour at my trade. So like for me to move to the mountains and take a hit and then not be able to travel didn't quite seem worth it to me at the time. That was my strategy. Everybody has a way to do it, right? Sometimes you're lucky enough to have wealthy parents, and sometimes you do it by the trade or whatever you do, right?
Don't look at me. Yeah. That wasn't me.
However you figure that gig out, but you got to have some sort of gig, right? Whatever you do. And that was just the way I saw it. That was the way that worked for me.
Well, and you probably traveled. A lot of the guys at the lake would do a trip every year. You might go to El Dorado. A lot of people go to the Winds every year. And so the lake was, you'd enjoy your climbing, you'd go away once a year. But you probably were one of the first guys to really travel broadly abroad, right? Hitting more places than the traditional DL weekend climber would go.
Yeah, like, early on, I got into climbing essentially to be an alpinist, right? And in the process, did these backpacking trips when before I climbed, and I got into it to be an alpinist. And then the minute you start to rock climb, and everything you learn about alpinism, it's like everybody tells you got to have a really good rock climbing base. And the minute I got into rock climbing, not only was I felt like I was good at it, other people tell me I was good at it. And then you just get off in this divergent, okay, and now I'm rock climbing, and then I go back to alpine climbing. So literally the 40 years I've been climbing has always been a mix of, I'd go at it hard to rock, and then I'd get into alpine climbing for a while and then go back to rock climbing. So kind of back and forth. But, the first real road trip I did was to go and like live in Chamonix for a summer. And that was eye-opening because then you're like around, like in our campground, we had Rich and Stevie Hostin and there was a bunch of other guys. Clay Wadman. I climbed with Clay Wadman in Chamonix. So we had this odd mix of guys from in the campground. So it was cool. And the bar is high in places like that, You learn the trade, you learn it quick, and you learn it in a big arena. So the experience comes faster. And then, that was my thing. I learned right away that, it's better to be in these big arenas. And then when you go to a smaller arena, the stuff seems more manageable.
So you guys dropped the DLFA a second ago. And there's sort of like this thing with this group that anyone who knows who they are just like, oh, yeah, the DLFA. And they kind of like expect you to know what the fuck is going on. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I feel like from what I understand, you were like a kind of, Dave, I don't know what your affiliation with that group is, if you guys have the tattoo somewhere or whatever, but it seems like you're a little bit more of a fringe player in like the core of it anyway. But tell just explain what that was, or I guess it's evolved into everybody having kids and stuff, but what was it? What is the DLFA? It's such this big part of the mythology of Devil's Lake.
It's such a straightforward question, and we all struggle with giving a straightforward answer. It was a bunch of young guys that were pretty ambitious in their climbing, all colorful characters that just enjoyed hanging out with each other, and I think we stood out. I'll be interested to hear your answer, Dave. I think we stood out. One, they're colorful. Two, there's take beers up to the crag. And then being young and, perhaps a little obnoxious relative to that established scene. Because when, if you looked around at the lake of all the people hanging top ropes in the mid 80s, and there were a lot of them, it was the Chicago Mountaineers, it was the Hoofers from UW-Madison, it was the Iowa Mountaineers. There were all these kind of old school established clubs that were, all doing their thing, and it was all great. And there was just this group of people climbing a little harder and maybe a little more rowdy at the time.
climbing in those days, it was always identified as a little bit of a group. People all would ask, "Oh, are you part of a club or something?" And I think that's what sort of fired the DLFA thing. And I think it was a little modeled after the Vulgarians from the Gunks, and
which they had the same motivation.
Yes.
The exact same motivation was to break free, but also take the piss out of the fuddy-duddies in the different groups.
It's how you It's how you think when you're in your early 20s against the establishment, and I'm doing air quotes here. If you
well, I mean, I just wrote down the word punk.
It's a little bit of that.
It's punk rock. I mean, it's just that's
exactly
what it was.
Yeah. It's a little rebellious. You want to do things your own way, and these guys and you say I was on the fringe. Certainly on climbing ability, I was definitely on the fringe with most of those guys. But as I say, and Sangdal put it really well. And he always said, to be in the club, you have to be interested in climbing as hard as you can, and that didn't matter if it was 5'8" or 5'12". But the whole lot of those guys were climbing 12 and then went on to 13s and harder things.
Yeah, I mean, me and Leo came into it, a little bit sort of early 80s into it. And I think Bill Russell, Tommy Deutschler, and I think Sangdal was pretty quick to the DLFA. But I think the whole thing was kind of a brainchild of Bill Russell.
Okay, and this is the Bill Russell that has deep roots in Yosemite. And
for sure.
Right.
I mean... And he's, Bill is, everybody knows, I mean, the guy's got a reputation. He's a great climber and a mountain guide, in the valley. I think he just recently retired, but he was kind of the, the founding fathers of it. And then Tom Deutschler and Tommy, both of those guys are really good climbers, pretty different in their climbing styles. Tom was an alpinist. I mean, and he just recently passed away, but, great resume, had the first lead of Bagatelle, which is, like if you want to describe that, I don't know if it's a 70-foot, 512 CD, super thin quartzite face. That's just an amazing route. And really, I mean, now it gets head pointed, it's probably had 12 ascents maybe in that time. Tommy did the first ascent in like 78, 79. I did the second ascent in the like 86 or something like that. And now it's been done pretty regularly. But so that was Tom, and he'd like go to Europe and...
Well, wait, hold on. 12 or so ascents is not pretty regularly.
No, it gets done more today.
Okay.
Like maybe I watched Sky Groki did it last spring, and I watched him do it, and it was cool to watch.
Right. And he's like the horse right now, right? He's the guy pulling the wagon towards these things.
But they're out there getting it done.
Right. But wait a second. So it was it was a top rope first.
Pete Cleveland top rope.
So that's what I thought. So Pete Cleveland, which we'll have to talk about Pete Cleveland, because he's also, he's definitely enshrined in the mythology as well. But so it's sort of established as a very, very hard climb, but as a top rope, which is the ethic in the lake. But then along come these guys, you guys, and that are trying to lead some of these long established top ropes if they have any semblance of gear in them, sort of grit style. Am I getting that kind of sort of vibe right?
Yes. Our goal was to lead everything that they didn't,
right?
Like pick up where they left off. And I don't think Pete Cleveland, like when Tommy did it, I don't think Pete thought it could be led,
Right.
But you got to keep it in mind. Like these guys were up there. Pete did it in Vasca Center.
Sure. Yeah. And
probably hemp rope or something.
Yeah. And then if there were nuts, they were actual nuts or whatever, like kind of, and certainly not RPs and things. Cause like you said, that technology opens that whole game up. I mean, it's synonymous. Like RPs is a synonymous phrase with grit climbing, and it's like, well, if it's scary, it had RPs. Exactly, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like that word.
Well, we had our own. No one
even knows what it stands for.
We had our own sort of. We had an unusual ethic about this. So the ethic that we had was, Devil's Lake started, and interestingly enough, I listened to your interview with Erickson.
Okay. Oh yeah.
And he, Jim Erickson. And he talked about when you climb at Devil's Lake, if you've never driven a pin, you won't notice it. But if you've driven pins, there's pin scars all over the place, And so when we started to lead some of these 12s, the ethic was if you couldn't do it with the gear we had, it was acceptable to use pins if it had not been free climbed. Once it was free climbed without pins, once somebody said, okay, I'm just running it out on the RPs, then it was off limits. But some of the first ascents of those routes were done with steel.
Okay.
Driven on lead.
Okay.
Driven on lead. And Tommy legend has it was a ground down RERP. Not as if the RERP wasn't small enough to begin with. He went up there, hammered that in, and I don't know, because you've led it. What's above that? There's a...
Yeah, let's do a little moment here. This root just gets tossed out of there as like, bagatelle. Well, it's bow down to me, but like, what does it involve?
Just to put it in context, like if you went out anywhere in North America, whether it would be Eldo or New River Gorge, and you bolted that thing, it would be, today it might be rated 13A. It's right up there. And it's always, people are always afraid to put a 13 up. But I know a lot of guys that say that thing's just 513. But it's considered like 12C for Devil's Lake. And it's hard. You have a couple, the lower move is maybe like a V5 boulder problem that you basically do with no gear. You get up in the face, you put in I used a bunch of the offset HB nuts. I put 2 HBs in. And then when I did it, I drove 3 knife blades and then equitensioned them. And then I had 2 wires that I put a copper head over the top of those to make sure they stayed in place. So I did it on double ropes. Now the current way is to just use the bottom wires. And where I put the copper head, the wires are good enough. They just, they stay in they call it the bread loaf is the feature. So the guy put wires in the bread loaf and usually do it with 2 separate ropes. And then you got to do what they call the sword fighter move, which is maybe not as hard as the entry level move, but it's still, I don't know. Hopefully I'm getting these boulder grades right, but I would consider it still maybe like V4, V5. So that's, and you're doing these things pretty run out. And I mean, if you blew it and, after that, you still got to do a pretty technical mantle. And for me in the lead, the mantle was the crux for sure. Because if I was going to fall, you're pretty far out there. You're going for a long fall. And you got to kind of muscle up on this mantle and then go into a move where you get in a finger crack and drop a wire. And then it's game over, right? You got a piece of gear that this unquestionably will keep you off the ground. But the other stuff looks good. Would it hold a fall?
Yeah. Has anyone ever fallen on this stuff?
No.
So the pins you're put in on your lead go?
Yes.
And then they're removed?
Yes.
And the next person has to do it again. So it's not like the Eldo thing where the pins stay or whatever.
But these are like black diamond, at the time, Chenard knife blades.
Right. The
so
shortest
there was a
ones.
little horizontal seam, and I drove them in probably a half to 3/4 of an inch and hero looped them.
Right.
To a common point.
Right.
And
it's the aid climbing thing, like build yourself a little
sure.
deal.
Yeah. You're building, it's an aid
your
climbing
mid the leg kind of thing, yeah.
And I did that from kind of like it's like a pseudo rest. You don't really get a rest, but for that route, the holds are pretty big, so you can go out there and build that. And then you climb up and you put a higher piece in this bread loaf, and then you kind of go for it. So you got these 2 pieces, and I mean, if you fell and those pieces held, you wouldn't hit the ground, but you'd be damn close.
So the other part of the ethic, and I kind of want to ask about the influence of it as well, or what influenced it. But, you've top roped the thing. So it's like true head pointing.
Yeah, but the other side of this, and this is like today, the guys take the head pointing thing pretty seriously. Like they do it a lot. And we would always get some criticism for how much we top roped the route before we let it. So like when I let it, maybe I top roped it 6 times. I didn't have it mercilessly wired. I mean, I knew it, but I didn't do it 50 times, and we were always like, somebody said, well, you did it, you got it mercilessly wired. And I'd be like, well, I climbed it a few times, but I mean, still it's pre-rehearsed. And now the guys that head pointed, they're very careful. They know every single move and every single piece, which is smart. I mean, we were more concerned about, people kind of putting shade on our effort.
Well, that's what I mean when you said criticism. I'm like, criticism from your bros, right? Like,
yes.
Not criticism from like the editor of Climbing Magazine
No,
or
but
whatever.
Maybe other people that weren't. Everybody in climbing plays different games with it.
The criticism would have been from people that couldn't, in their wildest dreams, be up there on lead on themselves. Because no one, anyone who's operating at that level of either grade or seriousness is going to appreciate a guy who is up there. And so what if you topped her up at 6 times or 8 times or 10 times, man? You're up there and it's serious stuff you're involved in.
I think, oftentimes how a history of climbing goes is these things get done with better style. Like shortly after I did the second lead, it was soloed, which is obviously,
Who
better
did that?
style. Mike McCarran. Do you know Mike?
No.
Oh,
He lives
yeah,
a Colorado
climber.
guy.
Oh, okay.
He lives here now.
Yeah, he was a South Side Chicago boy. Just super talented climber.
Right.
No.
So he was probably just like, well, all this gear's not going to hold, so why do I waste energy putting it in or what? That's kind of a
I would have come
solo.
to a different conclusion,
Right.
just staying on the ground.
Right. It's like ice climbing. Like, should I just keep going or should I waste my last energy putting an ice screw in?
Yeah, I think everybody that climbs a certain amount of time at the lake, at least in those days, free soloed a bunch.
Something hard.
Yeah, soloed something hard. And my thinking was, if there was gear there, I was going to use it,
So a couple more questions in this, the DLFA thing. So with this happening, right, these things like the first lead of something would be an event. Would you sneak off and try to do it without a peanut gallery? Like what did these things look like?
I don't remember because I belayed you on that.
Oh, man.
Was anyone else up there? It was a quiet day.
When
Was that during the 10 days of fuckness?
Yes.
Okay.
So we always had.
We're getting somewhere.
Yeah.
All right.
10 days
I'm
of
writing that down. Oh, fuckness. Okay.
I think you were there, Rich was there, and so I get it confused because I went back a couple years later and led phlogiston, and it turned into like a fist fight at like the bottom of the cliff. So there was a reason for doing that, for like not wanting people around, because that was time like the big free climbing thing was a big deal. So if we were driving a pin, we didn't want somebody coming around and starting a scene, which was happened on phlogiston, when I led it. And
so like the clean climbing rather.
Clean climbing.
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And we just, the gear, like now when you look at all the like unique cams and different wires, and I've went and embraced all this new gear and bought all new stuff. And it's just it's still the same game, but it's just a safer game. The options you have for, DMM peanuts and, all the brassies and different, it's a different game. But to answer your question, we would, every one of those super hard leads, I wanted to do it like midweek on a nice crisp day when I didn't have an audience. If there's an audience there when you're top roping something and, you can do it in hero style or something, that's different. But for that, you just didn't, you don't want your head to be clean. You don't want anybody. And I'm like one of these climbers where don't give me beta, don't give me any encouragement. There's nobody that's going to say, hey, go for it. That's going to make me do it. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, So to answer your question directly, I did those with, very few people around.
Cool. I just was curious about like, if it was like, he's going to do the thing, like, and everybody, hump the keg up there and like the whole thing.
I think what would happen nowadays, if I was around something, I would be like, hey, do you mind if we, and if they said no, I would probably be like, okay, I'll just hear about it,
Right. Yeah. Well, the etiquette of like yelling encouragement to someone on something as dicey as that, that sounds really stupid. I think you just shut the fuck up.
You shut up.
Yeah. And nobody needs to have someone suddenly scream at them while they're like run out.
Let them focus on the task at hand.
You kind of, when you were talking about the DLFA, you were like, yeah, we brought the beers up to the crag, but the sort of debauchery end of the DLFA is as legendary. Well, maybe not, but it's up there with the climbing, at least in the stories I've heard, from what I understand. And again, now you don't have to like admit your own participation, but was there like that kind of sort of lunacy that went with it? I mean, what was the 10 days of fuckness?
Well,
I mean, it has the word fuck in it, like
yeah,
the fuck,
the
devil's like fuckness.
Let me answer that second, because I just get, when I think back on the different places I've climbed or different activities over time. I just see, were there some riotous times? Of course there were. Were there some things that may or may not have been illegal in the state of Wisconsin? Maybe. But it's what young guys are doing around the world every night. And there's plenty of guys doing it to a level that, we never did. So I think a lot of that, and it goes back to this theme I was talking about earlier, where there was just such a stead, established scene there. And, typically all those big groups that were there, if they weren't university based, were older guys that were there for a quiet weekend out of a little gentle top roping. And that was their thing. And then there's these young punks there that are, maybe a little rowdy. Boom boxes at the cliff. Oh my God. Yeah. Playing Cabaret Voltaire or something, just that was not to be put up with. And then also it was probably a little bit of, it's like the bolt discussion earlier, that little bit of ethic change of, okay, if we're leading something hard for the first time, you can drive some steel. I can't remember, was the good, the bad, and the jack. Somebody were leading, some guy was just berating you from the top of the cliff as you're up on.
That was a phlogiston story.
Yeah, it was phlogiston, yeah.
Yeah, well, the good, the bad, and the jacked, we put a pin in on the lead and left it there. And recently it was just finally pulled out. And now these routes like that one, it's like 12C and it's a really good route. And it gets led, I don't know, half a dozen times. I mean, it's a goal of, that's the one on Mountain Project where like my leg's hanging out. It's like a black and white thing. And I'm like dynoing for this ledge and you can see this tied off knife blade in the picture. And so I think pretty quickly as the wires got better, a lot of the people coming in were like, we just don't need to use the steel. And it was a phase of maybe a handful of years from maybe the first part of the 80s. And then the steel kind of was like, done. We're done with it, But as far as the DLFA thing goes, there were times when we'd get a bunch of people together and it was a party. And, there were people out there and like Rich, one day the guy's got a broken hand. His hand's in a cast. His fingers are sticking out. And he's like, the top ropes this thing, Cheap Thrills was like 12C and he's like high on mescaline. And he just goes up there and he smokes the thing. At one point he's like hanging off these holds and he's in his hands in a cast and his foot cuts loose and he just like throws and just dead points this thing, like campus boards it essentially. And people were looking at that going, holy shit. The guy was insanely strong. He was a really strong climber. But yeah, there were moments like that where there's some showmanship when people are like, these guys are nuts, They're up there, you can smoking and drinking and climbing like the hardest stuff there. So it made an impression on people. And, and then in the 70s, you got to remember it was this like big, wilderness backpacking. And some people were like, the whole sort of sideshow was just not cool to them. And I understood that, but it was, it's a crag. I mean, it's a popular place and it just sort of took on a life of its own. So not everybody liked the DLFA. I mean, there were a lot of people that we were not fans, for sure. You don't please everybody, but some people were like, if they're there, I'm going somewhere else,
That ethic or whatever. I mean, it's not really even an ethic. It sounds like you guys just wanted to do something different and wanted to climb hard and probably scare yourselves a little bit. But, I mean, were you inspired by like the sort of British head pointing thing, or was it just something that came out of necessity? If we want to lead these routes, we'll figure all this stuff out.
I think that stuff, in a way, I think it would be fair to say it happened in parallel. I think it was out of necessity. It was just a natural progression of that area. I mean, sometimes the rock dictates the rules. Like in Europe, for example. I mean, without sport climbing, there isn't any climbing, I mean, you go to Bukes, what are you going to do, Put tricams in pockets, it's just not going to work. So the sport climbing evolved in our area, the top roping, the rehearsing, the head pointing was just like the same as in England on grid. It was just the only way to do that stuff and keep moving forward. So I think the rules And we had rules and ethics, about what we were doing. And so, yeah, I think it was out of necessity. I don't think there was anything that was mirrored there. I think like when we started, like when I, would go and climb in England with Leo, it was refreshing to see that, because we always felt like that style, like there were definitely people like from California that would have looked down on that, and it was just like, well, that's what we do,
Yeah, totally. I mean, the whole rehearsal part of it in the 70s would have been taboo in a place like Yosemite or the Gunks even.
Yeah, and and it's also the rock dictates the style, but the timing and the arc of history does as well. So there had been enough really talented climbers there, like Cleveland did Bagatelle, when the dinosaurs were walking the earth. So for these guys that had the ability and the motivation, the way you're going to improve and make your mark on the place was to lead these things. And they were still in parallel, putting up even harder technical problems on top rope. Right. It was a kind of a parallel thing, right? You're doing these new top rope things that with no gear whatsoever. And then you've got this library of potential first leads there that are all really hard, dangerous enough where, the head point is not the least sensible thing in the way you approach
almost
it.
All the hard routes at Devil's Lake added in the 80s, in early 90s, like all the 13s and the harder 12s. Pretty much, I think it's almost safe to say they're all DLFA guys, Maybe there's a couple outliers, some of the repeats that went on in the 90s, like Jason Houston and, who led some of the stuff I would think in the early 2000s, maybe 2005, there was a renaissance where some of the stuff that, there's a couple things we just weren't bold enough to do that were done maybe 15, 20 years later as things kept going,
Well, it's interesting. There's a bunch of different things. Is that like, this anti-establishment punk rock vibe could have led to someone going up or a group going up in the middle of the night and bolting something, that happened other places where the punks here in Colorado, it did. Not that they were like bolting things that, had already previously been climbed or anything, but just the idea of like rifle and stuff was this big, FU to the establishment of a pure sport climbing, wrap bolted kind of thing. So it's interesting that like there was this anti-establishment vibe, but you were still guided by these basic principles of sort of, the rock dictates what happens. And our one little slide is we're going to use some pitons, which anywhere else would have seemed primitive in its own right, Do you know what I mean? Like you were still guided by the DLFA or these guys were still guided by this overarching adventure ethic and, by fair means, if you will, to quote.
I think to sort of
Messner.
backfill this whole story, I think you got to look at Devil's Lake, through the lens of sort of this overstory where you get the Stettner brothers, the Erickson brothers, the place just spit out a ton of really good climbers. John Gill, Pete Cleveland. And there's not a guy amongst those guys who didn't think Cleveland, he was really strong and a really good climber. So when we came in, we had all these guys ahead of us. So there's like, you just don't just show up and like outgun these guys. They were good. So we worked hard at doing what they did and then moving that ball a little beyond. But I think the whole, to frame it like, there's in the ethics of why they were so strong was, I think, sort of fell under the umbrella of that overstory. And, there were other guys in there like Al Chekalinsky and Scott Stewart. And, it wasn't just Cleveland. There were a couple camps like it always is. You got this camp and that camp. And then we were just some young guys out there. And, it's like anything, the next generation of guys, you look and go, wow, those guys are really strong. Pete Cleveland asked me one time, he goes, so are you taking steroids? And I was like, no, I was like, and I'm glad I never touched any of that stuff. I didn't want to sit in an interview like this and ever think that it wasn't just me, right? I just wanted to do it clean. But and then they watched, us kind of come in, but we had deep respect for those guys.
Well, and I would also, as for all the bad behavior and irreverence, what I found meeting these guys was they would have never admitted it, used this language. They had a real love for the place and a real respect for the rock and the environment and just the whole physical scene there. It was something really captivating about Devil's Lake. And, also, if you're a climber in the Midwest, especially at that time, it was the only game in town, right? So you were spending every single weekend up there. And even if you had days off work or a little vacation, you'd be going up to the lake. So it was just this very, intense microcosm for people. So I think that respect was there. And by the way, drilling in that rock, that quartzite is, I'm not a geologist, but it's probably as close to 10 on as the Mohs scale of hardness. It would have been a real undertaking to drill any bolts
it's like
that
when
thing.
you ever get into even really bullet hard granite, the quartzite is, a power drill, you would go right into it. But it isn't true that there are no bolts there, because Pete Cleveland put 2 bolts on this thing called Flatus, because he tried to lead it without bolts and fell off and broke his teeth. And I think that was justification.
And there's maybe 7 in Cicerta. I bet there was under 12 bolts in 1,200 climbs there.
I think all of us guys who started the sport climbing in the other outlying sandstone areas, none of us were in favor of bolting at the lake. So that was a pretty consensus. And I think if anybody would have started, it would have just been immediately dealt with and probably pulled, because the question came up, should we replace the bolts that were there? And the general consensus with that is no.
Yeah. And then the development of the sandstone areas, the outlying sandstone areas, which was starting to happen about this time, opened up new rock, new ways of thinking about doing the routes, new ethics, in parallel with a more accepting view in the States and interest in sport climbing. So that probably took some of the pressure off. Because I was saying the top rope problems that you guys were developing at the time, that there's no gear on them, right? There'd just be even worse than
some of them will, if it's somebody ever leads them, it'll be, it's almost a solo effort, I don't know. I wasn't always at the lake too, because I was beyond the road, and I remember somewhere in the late 80s, I came back and I lived in El Paso for a while, right near Waco Tanks, So that was my home area, and I saw that get kind of bolted. And when I moved out of there, I left there and I had a power drill, came back to Devil's Lake, and we had a bunch of, what we considered the sort of relevant, strong climbers of the area. We had a little powwow and said, hey, we're going to go to some of these outlying areas and bolt them. And most of the guys were in favor of that. It wasn't a consensus, but it was enough of a consensus that it wasn't like anybody was going to run up there and chop them. A few people were like, oh, we don't know that we should do it. But for example, up at Necedah, I don't know, have you ever been there, Chris?
No, I keep wanting to go. My I have family back there, and I'm in Wisconsin twice a year, but usually it's on family stuff, and it's usually at a really crummy time of year to go rock climbing, the dead of summer. So this last time, I found all these little bouldering spots that are near where my parents live, north of Green Bay. And
Pond, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I brought my freaking I brought a pad because I drove, and I was going to go out there, and I marched 30 feet into the woods, and I was like, I'm not bouldering in here at this time of year. It was in July. I was like, this is horrendous.
Too humid, too many ticks.
Too many bugs. And then everything's covered in cobwebs because no one's climbing on it. And I was like, all right. But I need to go in the fall. But anyhow, because I want to go down there. I want to check out your route. At the very least, the Whiskey Go-Go. And so, but anyway, tell me about Necedah then.
Yeah, so we went up there, and that was real. Those were really the first sport routes, kind of late 80s. There was one overhanging wall that has a couple cracks on it, and then some really nice overhanging faces, which we bolted. And it's become incredibly popular. And that place still has a mix. There's some traditional routes there, gear routes. So we didn't bolt everything. It wasn't sport bolted, but it was bolted. And then there's a few new areas that are getting more sport bolting. So, but yeah, so we kind of brought that sport climbing to the area. And most of us guys had been out on the road, saw it in Australia, saw it in Europe, and said, this is the way this is. The other side of that is that softer sandstone remember me and Rich Beckler took a trip into Czechoslovakia in the 80s. We got visas, went in there to climb, and, the whole knotted sling, no gear. And I was like, we're like, well, our rock is like really close to this stuff. I mean, it's very similar. And I looked at a route like Whiskey and thought if I did it, when I first did it, I did it like with 2 bolts and gear. And then I went back in the 90s and retro bolted it and put bolts in on the whole thing. And my justification for that, number one, I hadn't seen the second ascent, and it was a pretty good line. And I thought if it just saw as many ascents, now you go there and somebody's working on it literally every weekend when the weather's good. And if it had been done with gear, it just would be hammered out.
Let's just kind of talk about life a little bit. Going back to being a climber, being this super dedicated climber in the Midwest, kind of looking at Dave at the moment, that's kind of an interesting thing. And you would travel the world to these larger communities where there's just like this huge climbing lifestyle. But I think there's like these, there's this sort of very interesting thing that happens at these small areas. It's almost like this more intense love for a place like Devil's Lake with the locals than you have for people in Boulder about their crags that surround them. Although Elda has its dedicated people. So looking at your life, I mean, who were you like as a kid? Like where did you walk up to this climbing thing? And you said you didn't do it till 20, but it's a weird thing for a guy, what it would have been the late 70s. To find climbing in a place like Wisconsin in the late 70s.
Yeah, for me it was, I think the first exposure I had was rock climbing in the Boy Scouts in New Mexico, at Philmont, when I got on a top rope and really enjoyed it. And then when I got home, I just didn't think there was any climbing in Wisconsin, so I didn't pursue it until one of my high school friend's dad said, well, there's great climbing at Devil's Lake. And so we were like, hey, let's buy a rope and go out there and check it out. I mean, I was always really fascinated with climbing, read climbing books as a kid. And then once we got out there, we realized, wow, there is a lot of climbing. And very quickly, when you're like, climbing in leather boots and a Swami belt and, you got some gear, some of the other local climbers say, hey, maybe try doing it this way. Or I think I went and a week later, I came back with a pair of EBs, which were, what you had at the time, but came back with real climbing shoes. And I think for me, it was like when I started climbing it was special. I knew it's like, man, this is good for me. I liked it. Felt like I'd arrived at something that I had some ability to. And then fortunately, the place I was working, like 2 months later, they had a strike. And so I was out of work, like right out of the box. And we were up in Canada, like mountaineering, like 3 weeks later, or 3 months later after I started. So that was, there's a couple things like that really happened that kind of, it wasn't like I just got into it right away. And then I was like climbed the rest of the summer, pretty much full time because I was out of work. And I don't know, I was telling Leo this story earlier, but I know you've had Barry Blanchard on this thing. So we go up there and I got 2 buddies and you have your little Clint Eastwood thing and we're up there on Mount Lefroy and Mount Victoria with like construction helmets and like leather hiking boots with crampons on them and long axes, and we're climbing this stuff. And then we spend the night in the hut and Barry Blanchard's in there. We're all sitting around, we're all about the same age, and he starts talking about climbing and telling us these stories. Like of climbing El Cap, and I'm like, holy shit, this is really cool. And that like, it just inspired me, just to hear a guy like that. But so for me, it was lucky. I came into it, learned a bunch of stuff, got influenced by some people right out of the box. And I think by the time I had been climbing for 1 year, I had made a trip to the valley already. I don't think most people have that. They get into it and they climb in the gym or climb outside for like a year or two before they kind of wind up really going for it, So that helped for me.
What do you think it was? Do you reflect on it? Like, why that? When you say it was good, you knew it was good for you.
I guess telling you earlier, I was a dyslexic kid, and I think in my family, like when I found something that worked for me, they were like, oh, we don't have to, that's good for this guy, I think I just connected with it. Like the outdoors. And I'm fairly mechanical. So like the gear and everything, the whole, climbing's like a process, and the whole process of it just seemed like user friendly for me. I grew up as a Boy Scout. Like I said, I was a volunteer fireman, so I knew some ropes work and, I knew a little bit of that world, and that helps a little bit, The other side of it is, I don't know what it's like for you, Leo, but like, you're learning this on your own. And like literally you go to the library and there's like 2 books on climbing. You got Royal Robbins and the one with the white cover, like Learning to Rock Climb. I can't remember the woman's name, but I don't know if you know these books, but that was it. And then you just go out and you learn from different people. I was fascinated with it, And then once you get in it, in those days, climbing had a lot of romance to it. Literature, culture, photos. You go back and you read like some of the, that Chenard climbing ice book that he did in the 70s. I mean, there's just all these cool stories and poetry and, there was just an allure to it, Go back and look at some of that stuff. It was just a really different time. I mean, I look at some of that as more like a craft than a sport in a way,
What about you, Leo?
I got exposed to climbing especially for living in the States back here, now an unusual way. So the boarding school I went to in England, as many of those schools did, had a thing called the Combined Cadet Force. It was like an ROTC for sophomores in high school. So every Thursday afternoon, we'd have to put a uniform on and polish our boots. And there'd be about 20 minutes of marching around. And that was okay. But then you'd go shoot pre-World War II rifles, you'd go kayaking, you'd go hiking, and then they would have a little bit of rock climbing every now and then. And it was just, you'd be in army boots. It'd just be tied into a hawser-laid old rope that who knows from which World War that was from. But I just instantly took to it. And it's interesting. I'd never thought about this. What was the motivation there? But I always enjoyed the outdoor things. The movement's really interesting, the sense of accomplishment when you get to the top of a route. And the gear was always interesting to me too. So I kind of stuck with it, and then joined the climbing club in college, and then it was just off to the races. We were going out all the time, and that was in London. There may have been more than one climbing wall, but there was just one major one. And the same thing, it was a little bit like the lake. You go there and you start seeing what's possible if you just apply yourself a little bit to this. And very gratifying. You do a little bit of training, you're cracking a little bit harder problem every time you're there. And the other interesting thing too, I think that was similar here, is the climbing world was so much smaller back in the late 70s, early 80s, where whether you're at the climbing wall or you're just out at some crag on the weekend, you'd see all the guys that you'd be reading about in the climbing magazines. So it's just kind of cool, and they're all very approachable, and they're saying, what are you up to? And you just felt part of a really big scene there that at that time was just exploding in the standards there. So it was kind of even though, the difference is if you were a pickup basketball player in your local gym here, you're not running into Michael Jordan and chatting with them on a weekly basis. But that was actually, the analogous situation over there at the time. You go down, we'd go down to Pembroke for the weekend, and like Easter weekend, the whole British climbing scene for 80, 81, 82 was down in Pembroke. And you'd be hanging out with these guys and having a beer with them, and you see them on the crag and what they're doing. And it was just exciting. And then, you go out and you're inspired and you do your little bit. So I always liked that the camaraderie and of being part of something was always really gratifying for me.
So that's like, Moffat and Paul
Pritchard, Jerry, and I remember Andy Pollitt.
Andy Pollitt.
In Pembroke, he had 3 seconds with 3 partners because he'd wear them out one after another over the course of a day. And you'd see these guys, and it'd be the climb you'd seen in the guidebook or in one of the magazines, and then, oh yeah, man, there's Andy Pollitt doing that. That's so awesome. And then you race down to the bottom, and you do something that's like 8 grades lower, but it was the same thing. And one of the things I always liked about climbing too is, I still think the experience of a 5'4" leader going up, and he's leading a 5'5", is the same like whole physical and mental battle you go through when you're a 6, 8, 10, 12 climber along the way. So it's kind of the same experience that everybody's having out there, regardless of their personal ability.
Did you turn into the same kind of like widely traveling, climber that like Dave is?
No. Easy answer. I was never that interested in the alpinism part of it. My one real attempt at alpinism was we went to Chamonix. This is 1980, and it was 3 weeks of bad weather where there hadn't even been a guided party going up Mont Blanc. So we fled out of there. We went down to South France to the Calanques and just climbing on this beautiful limestone above a azure blue sea below. And it's like, oh, this thing's much better.
Yeah, that's some similar version of that happened to me at some point. Yeah. I can't quite pinpoint it either.
I'm not cold. I'm not as scared.
Yeah, I got plenty cold, plenty scared on entry-level alpinism, and that was my goal, but somewhere it fell away. I think for me it was more California, Southern California probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, when we met correct me if I'm wrong, but we met at Devil's Lake when you first went to work for Motorola and then went back for a master's.
Right.
And then so when Leo went back to England for his master's, then I would came over and climbed with him in England. And you were talking about like Moffat, and he's the one night when we went to I think it was a Bath hotel or something. We're up in Sheffield, right? And, Leo's like, meet me here. And I don't know, for some reason you were up there and I kind of went to London, took the train up there. And, we walk into this bar and it's like, there's Andy Pollitt, Jerry Moffat, Ron Fawcett, like anybody who is anybody in British climbing sitting in the bar.
And did we stay at Al Rouse's house that trip?
Boy, I can't
remember. I don't remember where we stayed.
Yeah.
That was another trip where, was staying at Al Rouse's house. And
but that was nice because his parents owned a business there. So he had a van we could drive. So we did one trip. We're tooling around doing Gritstone. And then we went back a couple years later and climbed in Scotland. Climbed a bunch of stuff on Ben Nevis. That was, for me, that was like a privilege because I don't know that I ever would have had those experiences if I didn't know somebody from the country who knew that countryside. It would be difficult. It would be difficult to duplicate that,
Yeah, I was a little bit plumbed into the scene there because of the guys I was climbing with, where they were definitely plumbed in with the Sheffield superstars. But yeah, no, and then the extent of my travel really stopped because in about 1990, I started getting wrapped up in marriage and kids and business and career and all of this. And, they say that as you get older as an athlete, you need to have more rest time and downtime. Well, I found now I'm getting back into it. Like 25 years was a little too long.
Right. Overdid the rest.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a couple months here and there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I wish I'd known that.
I think it's harder for young guys to do a similar path. I think today would be harder. Everything's just more money.
Right.
And we could go out on a road trip pretty economically. And that's what I feel like it seems like, I mean, in some ways it's a smaller world information and travel wise, but in some ways it's a more expensive and it's a harder world to do what we did. I mean, we would just go to these places and people were incredibly helpful. And you could go to Australia for 6 weeks with like $1,500 or something. And I mean, it just would cost so much more. And I mean, the value, and we were all trades guys, so we made good money. So it was easy to be like, okay, I got enough. I'm good for 6 months. I mean, I got a plan. I'm going here, here, here. I come to El Dorado and then I meet my buddies here and we fly to wherever. And, but I think it's hard to duplicate that. I'd feel, a little bad for younger guys because I just think it's just more expensive. It'd be difficult to have the same experience. And then there's so many climbers and some of the places are, it was easier to hook into that local crew then because, I mean, most people were welcome to have traveling climbers come in because they didn't see that all the time, Especially.
Yeah, we went to the Gunks, was it like $59 on People's Express out of Chicago.
Yeah.
It was cheaper to travel than it was to stay home and go to the lake for the weekend.
Right.
That was an early
trip.
trip.
Have you climbed there in the Gunks?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big hole in my resume. And I have plenty of people inviting me there too, including Russ, Russ Clune. I know Russ really well. So it's like, who better to get you to take you to the gunks? But, I'm a little biased. I have this interest in that era of climbing, this movement from sort of traditional ways of thinking and into sport climbing and things like that. But I also have this kind of bias that like your motivations in a lot of ways were sort of, to use a word that's a little testy, but like they were more pure. Like I know your name from climbing, but you are not necessarily a super famous climber, even though your resume is equal with some of the luminaries, quote unquote, from that time that everybody knows. But it feels like you just really wanted to travel the world and go climb. And also, we have this paradigm now where there is this pie in the sky about becoming a sponsored climber, get paid to climb, or like that didn't exist. So it wasn't something anybody was motivated by.
Well, I saw how hard like a guy like Todd Skinner worked at being a full-time climber, and what you kind of always have to do some new gig to stay relevant and put up, some new route. There's always some games you're playing to stay in the media. And for myself, I just looked at it like that was, and I knew plenty of guys and saw how they did it. And I just didn't, kind of feel it was for me. I thought it was just better to make my own money and then do exactly what I wanted to do. And sometimes in hindsight, I look back and I said, maybe I should have put my shoulder to the wheel a little more in self-promotion. And, there was a point when, guys would offer you, if nothing else, just for like pro forms and stuff.
Yeah, right.
Which sometimes are hard to get, unless you're in the rarefied air of a route setter at a bouldering gym, so.
But yeah, I mean, it was a time, and that's what we joke about too. It's like, it's like the professional climbers were getting free shoes, and that seemed like a huge deal. But yeah, it just seems like there was this kind of, like I said, sort of this love of the game sort of motivation that drove a person like you at the time.
For sure. Yeah, and I did want it. It was just like the discussion about, using steroids. I just wanted it to be me, And I had some instances too, like for example, like I know when I lived in Waco, and there were a handful of guys with apartments, and I actually had a job there. I was always working there. But I remember at one time, I was hanging out with Ron Kelk and Russ Walling a little bit, and Ron got like a check from 510, and they wouldn't take it at the bank. So I had an account at the bank, so I had to go down and cash his check. He's like the best climber in the world, and I'm cashing his check, and stuff like that. I'm like, I don't know, do I want to play that game? Now, 5-10 years later, it was different. Right. A guy could do a little better, but I always look at it like the parallel argument for me would be like, what did a pro football player make in the 80s? He probably made like $60,000. These guys didn't make millions. They played because they liked it. And then they laid the groundwork for the next generation of guys who could be sponsored climbers, right? So, I mean, if it hadn't been for us guys laying that groundwork down, some of those guys wouldn't have happened. I mean, they just didn't arrive on their own. I mean, there was, just like for us, we had guys who sort of did that work in front of us. I think some of us recognized that, and looked at it. And yeah, it's interesting because nobody ever asked me that question. And for me, it was a conscious choice. To just not do it that way and just do it my own way, and just be like, okay, if I'm going to get something out of this, it's just going to be because of my skill. And I mean, the truth is that I don't think anybody of our generation got any real notoriety until the internet days. Like, because for me, what happened was these younger guys, when Mountain Project started, especially in the Midwest, the guys coming up, they're spending their time looking at all these routes on the internet. And because I just got a lot of first ascents and hard first ascents, like harder 13s, and my name just kept coming up. And finally, they're like, well, who are these guys? Dave Groth or Rich Beckler. And, and then they start asking around, and eventually you bump into them, and I mean, really, it was the internet that kind of blew the thing, at least for me, open, got me like have some notoriety.
Right.
Had climbing just faded off in the mid 90s and hadn't kept going, and there wasn't all the internet stuff. I mean, I would be known by a few local guys in small areas.
Right.
That's the truth of it.
So did you guys stay friends the whole, like, for the last, whatever, 30, 40 years?
Yeah, forever. I get back to the Midwest maybe every 2-3 years and show up in La Crosse, or we'll meet up at the lake and do a little bit of climbing. And then the last few years we've been doing a little bit of ski mountaineering together as we both got into that. So,
well, but I kind of was wondering if, like, you're staying in contact. You talked about how, like, it was pretty much a weekend thing for you, or this thing that you incorporated into this other life of family and career. And you eventually did as well, but again, like, were you sort of just observing, like, and hearing about sort of Dave's trips around the world, or?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, you always want to know what this guy's up to, because it's always something pretty interesting.
Yeah. So what's a story, or what's a trip that he needs to tell me about that he hasn't yet, you think?
I think there's some, I don't know if it's suitable for airtime, but there's some good stories out of Czechoslovakia. Just trying to think. Arapiles was all pretty calm. We were out there just pretty focused on the climbing. We did that little side trip down to the south coast and the 12 Apostles with the car we went down you go to Horsham. What's the town between Horsham and back in Melbourne where the Ballarat Zoo? We went to the feeding of the Tasmanian devil. That was always a highlight. And then that car we rented. These are such tame stories relative to the DLFA reputation. But yeah, the car that just started belching smoke.
Even climbing stories. Like, where have you gone that you remember so fondly, but maybe doesn't fit into the narrative to talk about all the time?
I don't know. Like, I spent a fair amount of time in South France, back in the early 90s, in late 80s, early 90s. That was a good place to be. I mean, the French were just kind of killing it, And, down in Buttes. It was nice because the community was so small. You'd show up there, and, like, I would go without a partner, and just I'd bump into people that I knew from here, And it was small enough where, like, if you could climb at those grades in those days, it was just very easy to find a partner. Maybe you still can do that, I don't know, When I really got the fittest is when my son was born and I got off the road. And then I had to train, and I was living in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And his mom had traveled with me a bunch when I climbed. She spent a summer with me, like, in Germany. And we found a place to live we liked. We had Clayton, my son. And then I was, like, working, and, then I just got into, like, crazy amounts of hangboarding and this thing. You remember the term, the Skinner box, like the little, box that you'd build and then, like, boulder around the inside of this box, like crazy stuff like that.
No, I don't remember.
And I wish I had pictures of this stuff, because it was, I had a backer ladder and wooden, all this training equipment. And I moved to a town where there was no climbing, but there was a Dolomite area, so I started to develop that.
Okay.
And developed a couple of bouldering areas in western Wisconsin. But once I, like, had the time to, like, eat better, not be on the road. Our always adage about road trips is, like, your strongest day is your first. Sometimes, like, you're strong as when you take off. You get better, like, more technique and maybe climbing a little more fluidly, but generally you don't get that much stronger on the road.
No, you just get exhausted.
Yeah.
So
once I started, then I was able to jump it, like, up a notch.
Right.
It's funny. I was telling you, my son, when he grew up, he got a little bit of a belly full of me dragging him around to a few areas, and he didn't really start climbing until he got in high school. Now he lives here in Colorado, and he's primarily a boulderer, and a really good boulderer, So it's funny to see him, and at times I look at him and I say, "Man, you're just obsessed with this," And it's like, same, it was just the
little
same
tear
way.
rolls down your eye.
That was the same way, yeah.
So the Devil's Lake thing, all continues in its own form to this day, and it's a very unique approach to climbing, I think, in the world, really. Like, it's the Czech has the whole knot thing, and I think that the ethic in Devil's Lake has its own sort of uniqueness to it, and you guys, paid homage to these previous guys, and that feeling continues. But how involved were you, like through the early aughts, or whenever you were sort of more located there with the family and things like that, as things evolved out of the DLFA? I guess it sort of exists, or there was kind of a second wave, like our friend Eric Barnard and Jay was kind of like these latecomers to this group or whatever.
Yeah, when those guys were there when they were younger, and I've known both of those guys literally since they were like in high school,
right.
in Baraboo. And I just wasn't around a lot in those days. I mean, Eric Zishi was there a lot in those days. And, I was raising my son, and, I'd come in, once a month or something and climb some stuff. And, I kept putting up. I had one project I put up in sort of the, early 90s. But there was, there was some dead periods there where there was, it was primarily sport climbing.
Mm-hmm.
And the lake became
around the lake.
The lake became a place for more traditional climbing. People would go there to work on traditional climbing. And then somewhere like around maybe the mid 90s, the bouldering thing really took off.
Right.
So if you look on like Mountain Project, there's an incredible amount of boulder problems. And we always knew that at the lake. And but just, I think part of it, until the pad thing came around, where you got groups of people with pads, like there's a lot of problems there out in the boulder field that, you need a half a dozen pads to do them safely. So there was the bouldering phase, and then somewhere in the early 2000s, there was a few guys, this fellow Jason Houston, that took a few of the things we didn't do and upped them a little bit. He's a really good climber.
He lived out here for a little while.
Did he? Yeah.
In Junction.
Yeah, good guy and good climber. And now it's like there's a whole new group of guys that they call themselves, the crimpers of the purple wave. And there's a bunch of them. They're doing things that hadn't been led in a really long time and having a lot of fun doing it. And doing it in a little better style. So it's cool for me because I recently retired, so I spent some time there climbing with these guys and just kind of watching. So it's fun it brings back just a flood of old memories, and, just to see some of the routes get repeated. Some of these things are rated like, 11C and, just with bad gear. And the truth is, if you put them in a sport area, all of them they're probably undergraded by at least a few letters, in some case, maybe a number,
Right.
But so it's continued on, like any scene, it ebbs and flows,
Yeah, it does. I mean, I feel like over the years I've heard it and felt it. And like there's some, back in the day, hot flash in the magazine about one of these things getting done. So there are these little resurgence now and again. And it sounds, and I actually met, some folks that are involved in what was it? The crimpers of the
purple wave.
Yeah. And they're pretty psyched.
The day of Tommy's memorial, Robbie Ellsberg goes out and leads one of Tommy's routes, which was the first ascent of this thing all the way, which is like 12 BC. And Tommy did it on like tied off blades, but it was like, I got a few pictures of it actually, but it's in the very early 80s. And it was like one of the first really hard head points before he did Bagatelle. And, at Tommy's memorial, I was like, I just said about Tommy, I said, that fire still burns here today with this guy, Robbie, going out and leading one of his routes. It was cool that he did it the day of his memorial, So it was touching for sure. We didn't talk a lot about Tom, but he was a big influencer there for just like the guts of, just kind of going for it. And he was like just a hardcore guy,
What was his background? I mean, what did he do for a living? Like, what was he a world traveler like you guys, or was he just locked in?
He spent a lot of time in Europe, but he was an alpinist, rock climber. Tom just, he was one of these guys who just never really wanted to work, So he did little odd jobs, kind of got by and kept climbing. In order to really pull off like a good road trip life, you got to make some money. And that was you know what it's like. If to succeed, you got to have some skill. It's complicated. You got to figure out a way to make money, train, be able to pull some things together. And I mean, he was maybe short a few pieces of the puzzle to get really good, because he just always struggled with the money end of it, you know.
But he was probably the best climber off the couch that I've seen. Yeah, just so much natural talent there. And, you know, he wouldn't climb for weeks and weeks. And because when I showed up, I knew the legend of Tommy Deutschler. And you'd see this guy just be lying around. By the way, one of the most entertaining guys to spend time with. We used to just go drive up from Chicago, throw my sleeping bag down by his trailer. He'd come out and just unbelievably funny bullshit all night long. So you wouldn't see him climb, then all of a sudden he'd be up on the cliff and just climbing really, really hard, really smoothly. That guy had a lot of natural talent.
He was incredibly smart with a really good comedic timing and sense of comedy. He would have been a great comic, you know. Yeah. But I mean, it was just
that's how he could have made a living.
Yeah, I mean, I had several guys in my life that these guys were just not going to work, you know. And just like, I don't care. I'm just not doing it. You know, he had little odd jobs. He made money, you know, repairing furniture and doing some things, different things, you know. I think he might have worked at Midwest Mountaineering at some point.
I think he did, yeah. Up in the Twin Cities.
You know, he lived a tough life, you know, just, yeah, you got to take care of yourself if you want some longevity, you know.
You know, you guys are still climbing, right? And you're kind of talking about like, what does it take for me to get back to a certain level? Yeah. So what does climbing still mean to you guys?
You know, I mean, I still, like last month before I came out here, I bolted 4 new routes. You know, I put up a couple new routes and I enjoy that. I would like to try to get back to, you know, like over the last couple of years.
To lead Bagatelle again?
No, but it'd be nice to do Bagatelle again. You know, I can still climb at about a 512 level, but I mean, I haven't figured out the formula yet for climbing as I'm older. I mean, it's obviously a combination of changing some training, resting a little more. You know, I mean, it's like your shoulders, you know, just like you got to figure out ways to get strong without blowing your shoulders up. So I'm working on that. You know, I'm on a little bit of a Jim Danini kind of path, you know, where he retired and then climbed a little more. But yeah, we'll see. I'm just taking it one step at a time. I feel like, you know, contributing, putting up routes, maybe doing some stewardship and agency things in some of these areas where they need some work. Like last summer I went and I rebolted a whole bunch of 80s routes, replaced anchors, replaced chains, re-equipped some things, did a fair amount of work to what I feel is like improving some of the areas that have just been, you know, not really, I want to use the word taken care of, but not really. There's some things that need to happen. You know, like in my lacrosse area, you know, it's a whole thing with invasives but you know, we basically took an area and turned it into a climbing area, you know. And I'm sure you know what that's like, you know, it's a lot of work. And so I'm doing that along with just trying to get stronger again and just seeing where it goes. You know, as you get older, I mean, you just enjoy it because you just don't know when some injury is going to happen and take you down for 6 months, you know. So, you know, I don't have super high expectations, but I mean, I think it'd be awesome to sort of get back to like where I could climb 513 again. I think that would feel pretty cool.
That's not super high. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
When you just said that, when you said I don't have super high expectations, I was just like bullshit.
Well,
I mean, it's good. True. Super high goals. Let's just call it that.
Yeah, put it that way. But in the lens of like nowadays where these guys
no offense. I'm not saying you can't climb 513 again, but yeah, when you said that, I was like, you want to climb hard is what through my head.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you see what the standards is, and I mean, I think for us, I mean, we were able to do some of that. I mean, if the information now, it's so good for training. So I'm trying to go back and, you know, and just relearn some things too, you know, improve my techniques. And, you know, like I've learned a lot about pulling bolts and, you know, just and learning from some of the younger guys, you know, who are doing it professionally, are guiding and, you know, and I always want to like using best practice. So.
Well, if you start training hard, leave the backer ladder in whatever bin it's in the shed.
Of course.
Yeah, don't get that thing out.
I still have that thing.
I'm sure. That's why I said it's in a bin in a shed somewhere.
It was ruined many careers.
All right, one last thing. I'm a Western climber. I'm a Colorado climber, and so, when I hear about these little cliffs, I kind of have like part of me is like, yeah, whatever. Here we go on about fucking Devil's Lake again. But then the other part of me, and I believe this like fervently, is that again these small areas with these huge histories just breed this fanaticism that's really cool. But also like that ethic there, and it applies to the Gritstone as well, is that you talk about these routes, like some you mentioned like something that's like 11C, and anywhere else it would be harder, but also anywhere else it would be a bolted sport climb and completely forgettable. Like it would be a good route. Oh, that was a good route, but then you'd move on to the next good route. And these ethics that, I'm way pro sport climbing. I love it. But the ethics that have kept that at bay at certain places is what has created this like lore and this love and this longevity to the excitement about these routes. If they were like the Grit, I mean, it's tiny. I'm always like, zoom out a little bit, and you're just like, this is the thing. This is the area that everybody like freaks out about. It's like this little lump, this little escarpment, like on a plane, basically. You're like, but it's like this thing that's like got all this magic to it because they didn't just one day go and like, what's time to sport climb here? And so I think that's really special. I don't know if you have any comments about that at the lake anyway, in terms of like how it's held this magic to it because it did keep a little bit of this modernity at bay.
Yeah, I think it makes a really strong impression with the Grit. It's the setting, it's the history, and a little bit like Grit, it's such a distinctive stone that Devil's Lake quartzite is. Once you've been on it, you'll remember it forever, whether you loved it or hated it, right? It makes a lasting impression.
Yeah, and I think there's, like I said with the Overstory, there's a respect for the area and the people. I'm in a little bit of an outlier, that I've stayed there and climbed there that long. But and some people, learn there and just move on, but have great memories of it, But I think it's just a respect and people looking at it going, this thing just needs to kind of stay the way it is, There's nothing wrong with it the way it was always done. It was a pretty good way to do it. It's just kind of stood the test of time.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Dave and Leo for making that happen, a face-to-face interview here in Carbondale, Colorado. Super fun, super cool guys. Their heart's in the right place around climbing. Just love it. And also an awesome glimpse into sort of the adventurous, edgy, and counterculture nature of climbing back in the day. I know we get a lot of back in the day on this podcast, but it's a good perspective. There's this funny trend, I think, where people want to show just how comfortable they are when they go climbing, where they went to Europe and stayed in the nicest Airbnb and went out to the nicest restaurants and still managed to send, or they live in their completely tricked out, perfectly appointed van. They got the Starlink. They're running their hedge fund from the campground and still sending their project. Look at me, I'm living my best life. I don't know. To me, that old picture of John Sherman in the burning tent in Arapalis is a different form of living your best life. And that adventure is still out there, folks. You just got to work a little harder to find it. Take it from me, a dad who only sport climbs. You don't know adventure until you've cleaned up a kid's poopy undies inside of a portalette and rifle on a 95-degree day. I persevered. I overcame. If you want to hear more about Dave, Jay Noer at the First Ascent Pod did a great one this summer. Go over there and find that. Also, he is on Instagram. And I'm going to put up a bunch of photos he sent over at the website, enormocast.com. Some cool old stuff. Dave was quite the hottie back in the day. Tan, ripped, blonde. He looked a little more surfer than Cheesehead, actually. Okay, folks, whatever you're doing out there, I hope you're having fun. Although I also hope you're uncomfortable at times. You scare yourself a little bit. Fun is actually only part of the pie chart of why we climb. Don't forget it. But I also hope you're staying safe enough and, of course, checking your knots. Seriously, check your knots.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, you and the baby are independently, like you and the
we're
baby
both separately connected to the rope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, he's only a 25-pound baby, and like, it'd be easy to just cinch him in the backpack. I'm sure it'll be fine.